Welcome to Comical Recovery with your host, comedian Jessica Byrne, creator of the upcoming cartoon Buddies. That was my comedy writing alarm. So now we know it's time to write. But it's not time to write, it's time to podcast. Clearly, I'm not going to have the same thing that I had before as far as my intro goes, because I'm flying by the seat of my pants today. We've been talking about boundaries, and I have missed you guys for a week or so, 2, I think. Because the funny thing about my life is when I dive deep into something new I need to learn, the universe has a way of giving me practical experiences in order to practice it. So that is what's been going on lately for me, using practical experiences and circumstances to practice these boundaries. So I'm in the book Boundaries, and I'm going to keep reminding you guys, the author is Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. Boundaries, when to say yes, when to say no, to take control of your life. We're in chapter 4. And it's how boundaries are developed. And of course, it's got some happy time stories about kids and teaching your children boundaries and all that fun stuff. But I went through this chapter and I highlighted a couple of things, so that's pretty much what we're going to go over, because I don't want to keep you guys waiting, because these boundaries work. They work, okay? There's 3 different types of boundaries, but of course I did not bring my journal into this scenario with me today. But in my latest experience, I've been practicing non-negotiable boundaries. So it's like if you choose to yell at me, then I will walk into another room or remove myself from the house or whatever it is. That's a non-negotiable boundary where you set something else that's going to happen up with that decision. So the person makes their decision to yell, and, you're saying, well, if you choose to yell, then I'm choosing to leave. You're also choosing to be okay with the fact that I'm going to leave. The thing with boundaries in any way is that you have to do what you say you're going to do. You have to be willing to follow through. This is definitely some stuff that my therapist has talked about, and I will do my best to get up and look for that stuff. And then before I record the next podcast, continuing these boundaries. But today, in this moment, for this particular podcast, I'm staying put because I have injured my back and I am trying to take self-care. So sometimes we need boundaries with ourselves, and today's boundary for me is I'm not going to do too much. I'm just going to do enough. And that's going to be a really big challenge because I have a tendency to follow that up with negative self-talk, which is really trash-talking myself. And that's a fun trait that I'd like to get rid of and I'm working towards. But today we're going to stick with boundaries. And probably next time we'll stick with boundaries. We're just going to stick with boundaries until we got this thing, until we really get it. So on page 62, it says, God's desire is for you to know where your injuries and deficient. Oh my gosh, guys. I can read alone, but to say it out loud, it's a Wisconsin thing. I want to stretch all the vowels and make new words. Deficits. Woo, that was totally different than what I was pronouncing it as. So let me try the sentence again, because there won't be any editing on this. And I'm not going to apologize for it, because I'm just going to be human today. God's desire is for you to know where your injuries and deficits are, whether self-induced or other-induced. Ask Him to shed light on the significant relationships and forces that have contributed to your own boundary struggles. The past is your ally in repairing your present and ensuring a better future. So, boundary development is the next little paragraph. Boundary development is an ongoing process, yet its most crucial stages are in our very early years, where our character is formed. And like I said, this is about, childhood and what we have set for boundaries or our lack thereof. That's what creates how we move forward. Boundaries also develop in specific, distinct phases that you can perceive. In fact, by noting infants and children in their early parental interactions, child development professionals have been able to record the specific phases of boundary development. So bonding is the first specific stage, the foundation of boundary building. If we don't get any bonding in our youth, then we have a hard time trusting in future relationships. But of course, I have many things highlighted. So let's read a little bit about bonding. No matter how much you talk to yourself, read, study, or practice, you can't develop or set boundaries apart from supportive relationships with God and others. Our deepest need is to belong, to be in a relationship, to have a spiritual and emotional home. We are built for relationships. Attachment is the foundation of the soul's existence. When this foundation is cracked or faulty, boundaries become impossible to develop. We lack relationship. We have nowhere to go in a conflict. When we're not secure that we are loved, we are forced to choose between two bad options. 1, we set limits and risk losing a relationship, or 2, we don't set limits and remain a prisoner to the wishes of another. To bond with baby, mom and dad need to provide a consistent, warm, loving, and predictable emotional environment for him or her. So when that doesn't happen, that repeats itself in future relationships. Bonding takes place when the mother responds to the needs of the child, the needs for closeness, for being held, for food, and for changing. As baby experiences needs and the mother's positive responses to those needs, he or she begins to internalize or take in an emotional picture of a loving, constant mother. For those of us that did not have that, we tend to have a ripple effect of whatever we did see from our parents in romantic relationships. Oh boy, here's another word, guys. Give me a second. Object consistency refers to the child having an internal sense of belonging and safety, even when away from the presence of the mother. So it's talking about consistency. I've had this discussion with my therapist when I was teaching in a tutoring center about how to work with children or teenagers or whomever I had to work with, youth, young people, and consistency and congruency. Congruent in my actions. They know what to expect from me, even if it's mean, which it is not, because I have a difficult time being mean, especially when I have grown up with inconsistencies. So I can relate to what it feels like to not have that from the place that you're supposed to. Let's see. I try to be mindful, understanding, and compassionate about that. So the next part of the boundary development is separation and individuation, the construction of a soul. Let's see what I've highlighted, guys. As infants gain a sense of internal safety and attachment, a second need arises. The baby's need for autonomy or independence starts to emerge. 3 phases are critical to developing healthy boundaries in childhood: hatching, practicing, and reapproachment. Reapproachment. I think that's how I pronounce it. Hatching. The months of nurturing have paid off. The child feels safe enough to start taking risks. So it's this phase of discovering the autonomy. The hatching is allowing the child to explore its surroundings by itself and giving it trust while it's doing so, not hovering over it and trying to control every motion or movement or ignoring it. There's a sense of safety that needs to be built in the hatching of knowing that the child can come back to its parents and still get love and acceptance. But in many generations, we don't have that. And then they don't, we can't pass something on that we don't have. Practicing. While the hatching baby is overwhelmed by this new world and still leans a great deal on mother, the practicing child is trying to leave her behind. Practicers feel that they'll never be caught. In the practicing phase, children learn that aggressiveness and taking initiative are good. Parents who firmly and consistently set realistic boundaries with children in this period, but without spoiling their enthusiasm, help them through the transition. The practicing phase provides the child with the energy and drive to make the final step toward becoming an individual, but energetic exhilaration can't last forever. Cars can't always run at full speed. Sprinters can't keep up the pace for miles. The practicing child must give way to the next phase, rapprochement. Rapprochement, a restoration of harmonious relations. This time, the child brings a more separate self into the relationship. The child is ready to relate to the outside world without losing a sense of self. Anger is a friend. It was created by God for a purpose, to tell us that there's a problem that needs to be confronted. Anger is a way for children to know that their experience is different from someone else's. The ability to use anger to distinguish between self and others is a boundary. Ownership. Sometimes misunderstood as a simple selfish stage, rapprochement introduces words to the youngster's vocabulary such as mine, my, and me. This important part of becoming a self is often quite difficult for Christian parents to understand. Because they don't want their child to be selfish. But taking ownership of our wants and desires is a way to navigate boundaries. I want to feel safe. I want to feel secure. So I have to ask myself, how do I get that in uncertain circumstances? And what length am I willing to go to protect those things? Stewardship is another way, I think, to kind of represent ownership. Stewardship over our time, energy, talents, values, feelings, behavior, money, and all other things. I like that it mentions feelings. What I've seen in this society so far is that we want to brush our feelings under the rugs. Not necessarily in the new generation. They might be considered overtly feeling, but I don't know that that's true. I think generationally we still are covering up our feelings and deciding and making rules over what feelings are right and what feelings are wrong. And what I like about this section so far is that it talks about anger, and I'm just going to go over that again because I think it's so important. Anger is a friend to tell us that there's a problem that needs to be confronted. So it's a signal that navigates me to look for a solution, to look for another path, an alternative. Same with sadness. I can't move past something unless I grieve it. Otherwise, I'm just going to carry it along with me, and it's going to turn into depression, for me at least. So back to stewardship or ownership. Children desperately need to know that mine, my, and me aren't swear words. That's what I highlighted. It's kind of a weird thing. I must have, it is a different sentence, isn't it? No, the one word boundary. The word no helps children separate from what they don't like. It gives them the power to make choices. It protects them. And that's certainly something that isn't addressed. Parents don't want their kids to say no, but it's something that's really important because then as adults we get all this inner conflict when we say no. Guilt and shame come with this no because we've oftentimes been taught to be martyrs in order to be considered good people. When, if I give from an empty cup, I'm just making a resentment. I'm coming up with a resentment for myself. And my motives behind giving are not pure. They're, to appease someone instead of like a win-win situation. No keeps them from feeling complete helplessness and powerlessness. Parents have two tasks associated with no. First, they need to help their child feel safe enough to say no, encouraging his or her own boundaries. The second task is helping the child respect others' boundaries. So, boundary construction is most evident in 3-year-olds. By this time, they should have mastered the following tasks. 1, the ability to be emotionally attached to others, yet without giving up a sense of self and one's freedom to be a part. 2, the ability to say appropriate no's to others without fear of loss of love. 3, the ability to take appropriate no's from others without withdrawing emotionally. Noting these tasks, a friend said, half joking, they need to learn this by age 3. How about by 43? Yes, these are tall orders, but boundary development is essential in the early years of life. 2 additional periods of life focus on boundaries. The first is adolescence. The adolescent years are a reenactment of the first years of life. They involve more mature issues such as sexuality, gender identity, competition, and adult identity. The same issues of knowing when to say yes and no, and to whom are central during these confusing times. The second period is young adulthood, the time when children leave home or college and start a career or get married. Young adults suffer a loss of structure during this period. There are no class bells, no schedules imposed by others, and a great deal of very scary freedom and responsibility, as well as the demands of intimacy and commitment. This can often become an intense time of learning more about setting good boundaries. Boundary injuries. What goes on? Boundary problems are rooted in thousands of encounters with others, as well as our own nature and personality. Generally, the earlier and more severe the injury, the deeper the boundary problem. Withdrawal of boundaries. These are boundary problems. Not only good relationships, but also mature characters are built on appropriate no's. Developing children need to know their boundaries will be honored. Developing children need to know their boundaries will be honored. That was a Freudian slip. It is crucial that their disagreements and practicing. It is crucial that their disagreements, their practicing, and their experimentation not result in a withdrawal of love. So, when you have narcissistic parents, that is not the case. Their love is conditional. And I'm sure there's a whole spectrum of other toxic or sick people that haven't experienced proper boundaries. I mean, when parents are addicts, that's another issue. Or just when they have generationally not learned those things, then it just has a ripple effect. We don't know how to teach something that we've never learned or experienced ourselves. Parents need to stay attached and connected to their children even when they disagree with them. That doesn't mean they shouldn't get angry. It means they shouldn't withdraw. When parents pull away in hurt, disappointment, or passive rage, they're sending this message to their youngsters. You're lovable when you behave. You aren't lovable when you don't behave. The child translates that message something like this. When I'm good, I'm loved. When I'm bad, I'm cut off. And then that leads to super toxic loving relationships because you end up understanding that as love, speaking from experience. Parents who pull away from their children are, in essence, practicing spiritual and emotional blackmail. Children whose parents withdraw when they start setting limits learn to accentuate and develop their compliant, loving, sensitive parts. At the same time, they learn to fear, distrust, and hate their aggressive, truth-telling, and separate parts. If someone they love pulls away when they're becoming angry, cantankerous, or experimental, children learn to hide these parts of themselves. When children feel parents withdrawing, they readily believe that they are responsible for mom and dad's feelings. A parent's emotional withdrawal can be subtle. A hurt tone of voice, long silences for no reason, or it can be overt. Crying spells, illness, yelling. Children of parents like these grow up to be adults who are terrified that setting boundaries will cause severe isolation and abandonment. Hostility against boundaries. The second boundary injury Easier to spot than the first is a parent's hostility against boundaries. Hostility can emerge in the form of angry words, physical punishment, or inappropriate consequences. Discipline is the art of teaching children self-control by using consequences. Irresponsible actions should cause discomfort that motivates us to become more responsible. When parents greet their children's disagreements, disobedience, or practicing with simple hostility, the children are denied the benefit of being trained. Don't get that word confused, because we're all being trained in some way or another. So training isn't a bad thing. It's just about our habits. So they don't learn that delaying gratification and being responsible have benefits. They only learn how to avoid someone's wrath, which is no way to live, by the way. The result of this hostility are difficult to see because these children quickly learn how to hide under a compliant smile. And that leads to other issues, because then when you have this compliant smile, especially as a female, you start inviting inappropriate, not like inappropriate, but unwanted, unsolicited invitations that you don't want. Like, even if it's just conversation, because you literally have learned to smile through uncomfortable moments. So if you've got some jerk off hitting on you, you like smile because you think, I don't want to be rude, but that's giving a physical signal to this person that like, oh, keep talking. This, I like that, but I don't. I don't want to talk to you. I don't like that, so I shouldn't smile. But it becomes subliminal. We just do it on habit. So when these children grow up, they suffer depression, anxiety, relationship conflicts, and substance abuse problems. Hostility can create problems in both saying and hearing no. Over-control. Over-control occurs when otherwise loving parents try to protect their children from making mistakes by having too strict rules and limits. Over-controlled children are subject to dependency, enmeshment conflicts, and difficulty setting and keeping firm boundaries. They also have problems taking risks and being creative. There's the lack of limits. Lack of parental boundaries is the opposite of hostility. Sometimes a lack of parental limits coupled with a lack of connection can produce an aggressively controlling person. We're describing the person who has a difficult time hearing others' boundaries or needs. It's probably the experience of some narcissistic people if you've experienced that, or just some selfish people if you've just experienced that. Inconsistent limits. Some parents combine strict and lax limits, sending conflicting messages to children. Alcoholic families often exhibit inconsistent limits. They're always waiting for the other person to let them down or attack them unexpectedly. They keep their guard up constantly. Setting limits is traumatic for adult children of alcoholics. Saying no might bring respect, or it might bring rage. Trauma. A trauma is an intensely painful emotional experience. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are traumatic. Accidents and debilitating illnesses are traumatic. Severe losses such as a death of a parent, divorce, or extreme financial hardship are also traumatic. A good way to look at the difference between character-relating patterns such as withdrawal and hostility and trauma is to look at how a tree in the forest can be hurt. It can be fed inappropriately with bad ingredients in the soil, or it can be given too much or too little sun or water. That's an illustration of a character pattern problem. Trauma is like lightning hitting the tree. A trauma can affect the boundary development because it shakes up two necessary foundations to children's growth. 1, the world is reasonably safe, and 2, they have control over their lives. Children who undergo trauma feel these foundations shaken up. They become unsure that they are safe and protected in the world, and they become frightened that they have no say-so in any danger that approaches them. And that is also no way to live, because then you're walking through life in this way of waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for, the storm after the calm. And, it's just very anxiety producing. So the last thing in this particular chapter is our own character traits. So it's got an example. Some people with a constitutionally greater amount of aggression deal with boundary problems more confrontationally, and some with less aggression shy more from boundaries. My personal experience is that I've had a bit of mix of both. Definitely had a lot of condition in my upbringing. If I'm good, I'm loved, and if I'm not, I'm not, and that's okay. Because through many trial and tribulations, and lots of therapy, I have learned that those things are not true. Boundaries are super uncomfortable when you haven't grown up with them, when you are navigating them for the first time in your adult life, and you're changing everything that you know. And that is actually the first step. Is there's like stages. The first stage is awareness, becoming aware of the boundaries that you lack in the first place, or becoming aware of how love is conditional and how that shows up in your life. And I'm not going to pussyfoot around, guys. Every single one of these things that you encounter and learn is painful. It's painful. It hurts temporarily, not forever. And the good news is, if you step into the pain, you can step out of it, but you have to step into it. You have to feel it. You have to sit with those emotions, not in a pity party sort of way, but in a fully immersive way of like strapping into a roller coaster, getting on the ride of that emotion so that you can see the ups and downs and the journey in which you got into that core belief in the first place. Okay, well, my parent has a personality disorder that's generational, that they got from their parents, so they got taught and probably biologically ingrained those survival techniques that are their personality traits. Now I can choose to participate in the absolute shit show that is the way that they treat me, or I can set up some boundaries so that when I make the phone call and interact, I keep it short and I try not to divulge too much of my personal life so that I don't have things used against me. Because that's how that unfolds for me. But once I set those boundaries where they started, I no longer accept that into my personal life either. The example I will end on is this. One day I was in therapy and we were discussing my relationship with my father, which is a fairly good relationship, but I have expectations of, I don't know, a father. I have expectations of asking my dad dating advice and, him giving me any kind of fatherly advice, but it's not going to happen. I have expectations of him giving a shit about what has happened in my childhood. He's not emotionally capable of that. And that's okay. It doesn't make him a bad person. But it hurts me every time I call and expect him to be something that he's not capable of. So once I realized this, I realized that I'm constantly chasing, or past tense, I was constantly chasing emotionally unavailable men because my father is emotionally unavailable. So I set these boundaries because if I'm going to keep chasing my dad for emotional availability, I'm going to keep chasing other men in my life. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to put my dad in a box, and I'm not going to expect any emotional support because he's not capable of doing that. And I'm going to go and get it from the men in my life that I can, my male therapist, my emotional workshop facilitator, my boyfriend. But I didn't have the boyfriend option until I decided that I was going to get those things from the other two safe people. I needed to find positive, safe men in my life to practice that with so that when the right man showed up, I knew what it looked like. That's why boundaries are so important. Until we build our little fence around ourselves and, decide that we're worthy of protecting and building a fortress to protect ourselves, there's a lot of steps that go into that, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it's a process, and it's painful, sometimes a little painful, sometimes really painful, but totally worth it. As we set boundaries in our relationships, in our life, in our personal life, we can carry that into our professional life and totally change our reality by starting to look deep within our core values. So that's my piece for the day. We finished chapter 4. Next is let's see, what's the next? What's next, guys? What's next? Oh, it's the 10 laws of boundaries. That's going to be a biggie. Might have to split that one in two. But I will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me. Remember, laughter is the best medicine. If you can't laugh at my pain, then comment below. Give me a hard time. I can take it. Give me some suggestions or ask some questions, because that's what this is all about. Reading for me and practicing what I preach. So I hope that these new discoveries are helpful and we can go into this new year with boundaries and positive expectations so that we can manifest the life of our dreams. Let's do it together. Thanks for joining me. I'm your friend and host, comedian Jessica Byrne. I will see you guys next time.